My name is Anna Sabino. I'm the program director for the College Diabetes Network. For those of you who are not familiar with CDN or the College Diabetes Network, we are oh good, someone can hear me, a small nonprofit. We are based in Boston when we are not all at home on our couches. But we are primarily focused on providing peer support programs and resources for young adults living with type 1 diabetes. I was diagnosed in 1989, so I've got over 30 years under my belt of syringes and CGMs and pumps, and my t:slim is actually charging at my laptop as we speak. So I've been to all the conferences. I'm actually a social worker by training, as well as a CDE, or the new phrase now, CDCES, however they call us. And I love working with young adults and parents. It's kind of my sweet spot. So really, really excited to share with you our expert in the room. We know that, right now is really crazy. There is a lot going on. There is a lot of questions unanswered. There's a lot of what ifs and when and how. So hopefully tonight we'll be able to answer some of that, or at least make you feel a little bit better about what some of these future thoughts and future plans may hold in store for you. At the end, I will be talking about some of our resources for CDN. We have a lot of booklets and guides and webinars that talk specifically about accommodations for type 1s. We work very closely with a lot of the higher ed member associations. I know Kristina has loads of connections, but without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Kristina, and feel free, I can see the group chat, so feel free to, this is going to be a really open discussion, so feel free to type in your specific questions as we go. We'll also be sending out at the end a quick little mini survey with links to all of our resources that you can download, including some from both College Diabetes Network and Estrela Consulting with Kristina's group. So, so thrilled to have Kristina Dooley join us. She is one of a very few, I'm going to see if I can get this right, certified education planner. Is that right?
Certified educational planner. Yep.
Educational right. planner. Yep. Lives in Ohio, mom of a T1D. I know I've met the awesome Dooley family at some of the Friends for Life conferences, but I'll let her kind of share a little bit about her and her story, and then we'll get into the real meat.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me, Anna. I'm thrilled to partner with CDN to do this. And as Anna said, I am a mom to 9-year-old triplets. One of them, Isa, has type 1 and was diagnosed shortly before her 2nd birthday. So we've been in this for a little while with type 1. So I actually recognize some of the names on the screen from Friends for Life conferences and JDRF things. So it's good to see some familiar faces, or names, I should say. I'm not seeing your faces, but I'm seeing your names, which is totally okay as well. And so aside from being a type 1 mom, I am also a certified educational planner, like Anna said. So my day job, other than managing my children now, which has its own set of challenges, that's for sure, is that I work with families navigating the college search process. I've worked in higher education in some way for the past 20 years. I've worked both on the other side of the desk as an admission officer reviewing applications. I've worked as a school-based college counselor, and now I've worked independently as an educational planner for the last, 12 years. And so my company is Estrela Consulting, and we're based in Ohio, but we've got locations and we've got consultants in other places. We have a team of 8 of us. And our job is really helping families navigate this process, which I don't know the ages of everyone on the call, but depending on when you yourself might have gone through the college process, it's very likely it looks very different than it did when you went through it now. And so part of the thing that we're seeing right now in this COVID-19 era is that there is so much turmoil in what we've traditionally known in terms of the process, everything from testing, ACT and SAT testing, AP exams, those are all, just a lot of craziness happening in that world, but also things like this campus closure time has eliminated the opportunity for students to visit campuses, to get an idea of where they might want to go. And so depending on what year your child is, if you've got a senior this year, that could be a challenge. Juniors, obviously. If you're early on in the stages, like 9th and 10th grade or even younger, and actually if you want in the chat, you can put what year your child is, or whoever you're representing. If you've got a child, maybe you don't have a child, maybe you're just curious about what's going on in the world. You can feel free to put that in there. That might be helpful just to steer the conversation. But I can assure you that right now, what's happening there, the common answer I think that we're hearing from a lot of people on the college side is, we're not sure yet. I actually, right before we got on this, I was looking through one of the resources that we'll share with you, which is a list of what are campus plans for the fall. There's a publication called the Chronicle of Higher Education that's keeping a running tally of, what are colleges doing? Are they opening? Are they virtual? Are they closing their doors? What's happening? And it was, as I was looking through this list, I had to write down these words that were sticking out to me. We're leaning towards doing this. We're expecting to do this. We're hoping that we can do this. We're intending to do this. There is no we are. There's no firm, this is what's happening. So what I'm hoping maybe we can do tonight is I can answer, that would be my daughter's high alert. What I'm hoping that we can do tonight is maybe one, alleviate some of the fears that you might have, but also talk about the things that you can control in this process. And you guys know, as type 1 parents, there are things we can control. There are things we cannot control. So we are much better served focusing our energy on the things that we can control. And so that's my biggest, I'd say that's my biggest wisdom when it comes to this, is let's focus on those things. So Anna, do you want to just jump in? Do you want me to just?
Yeah, I wanted to give you, lots of people have kind of told us where they're at in their journey. So we're kind of all over the place. We've got a couple juniors, 10th graders, a senior, a couple of freshmen. So all the gamut in terms of college search process. And if I remember correctly, back about 15 years ago, they really start you right in 9th grade. You've got like a whole process starting from the second you walk into the high school doors about where you're supposed to be following along that college search journey. So I think you've already kind of started, Kristina, to I think hopefully that's where, every parent of a type 1, I have a 7-month-old and a 2.5-year-old upstairs, hopefully still sleeping. And, just calming those fears and really, looking to someone other than CNN maybe to let us know, really what is safe knowledge at this point. I know you said you don't know, and I really like the way you outline that. And, we're intending, we still don't know, and every day we learn more. But what is your gut, or what, as someone who's an expert in this, what do we know, and what is safe to kind of tell this really always stressed and worried group of parents?
Yeah. And I think there are some things we do know. I mean, there are some things that we can, even assumptions we can make that I think are probably, pretty accurate. I will tell you, I've been spending a lot of my time, other than chasing around my children and getting them to do things in the house, I've been spending a ton of time, as probably a lot of you are, looking. Like, for example, I spend a lot of my day listening to webinars with, you're not doing that, but I'm doing this with people in my industry, with deans of admission, VPs of enrollment, hearing about what are they doing and what are their plans for how this pandemic will affect how they do their jobs. Meaning, if we eliminate standardized testing, what takes its place? That's a really good example. A lot of parents say, okay, well, if colleges are going test optional, which is something that's happening, I should mention that. So, for those, whether you've got a 9th grader or you've got an 11th grader, there's a strong likelihood that the testing landscape for your child is going to look very different than it did for this year's seniors, for example. Right now, almost 100 colleges just since March have gone test optional, in addition to the over 1,000 colleges that were already test optional. A lot of people don't realize that there have been colleges for years that have not required ACT or SAT testing. And that's shocking to some people because we just assume that's a natural part of the application process. We spend a lot of money on test prep. We spend a lot of time, getting kids to work towards these exams. So now a lot of these colleges have gone test optional because the test dates are getting canceled one after another because of this. Obviously, we can't, testing centers are schools, so you can't do that. And so colleges are announcing that they're going to be test optional for the classes of 2021, 2022, and in many instances, 2023. So that's really, everyone in high school right now. My gut tells me that some of those colleges that are going test optional temporarily will make it a permanent fixture after this, because they will do their own internal studies on whether or not testing really does indicate the success of those students in their institution. And so it's not to say that if your child's a good test taker that they shouldn't be taking those tests, or if they are a junior and they've already taken an ACT or SAT and done pretty well and feel like it's a good example of their ability, they should still plan to submit those to the colleges they're applying to. Test optional doesn't mean don't send them. It means we won't require them. We won't necessarily say that's a required part of the admission process, but most admission directors would say, if you've got scores and they're good, send them in, because that's another supporting piece of evidence. So the testing landscape, like I said, will change. Some of you might be familiar with things like SAT subject tests. They used to be called SAT2s. Those will be probably completely gone by the time, especially like the freshmen that are on the parents that are on this call. Those are they're not required by a single college in the United States anymore. MIT was the last college to require them, and about a month ago they said no more. So they still urge students to consider taking them, but they aren't requiring them. So that's out the window. One major thing I want to mention about testing that's important, that affects especially the 11th and 10th graders on the call, for those families, is that ACT and SAT have just announced that they will be adding the option of doing remote testing, meaning taking an ACT from home or an SAT from home. They're planning to roll it out actually in September of this year. And as you can imagine, a lot of colleges will be uncomfortable with that because they won't know in terms of, it's not been tested, the test hasn't been tested in terms of security and the value of the scores. Is it the same as a traditional paper-based test or an in-school test? And so last week, Claremont McKenna College in California, they were the first college to come out with a public statement saying, we're not accepting those. So if your child is planning to do that in September, I would pay attention to the colleges that are going to eventually come out and say, we won't take those scores. So just something that I think that's a good piece of advice from the testing piece, is that the test prep companies are just that, they're businesses. So they're trying to find ways to increase their revenue stream in light of all of this going on. So with the elimination of testing, and you can jump in with questions, by the way, I should mention this. If you're listening in and I mentioned something and you want clarification, Anna's monitoring the chat, so you can ask any questions you have. One last thing I'll mention though, in terms of the testing landscape, in terms of if you're a 9th grade, 10th grade, is that, I mentioned test prep. A lot of people have said, oh, my child doesn't have much to do over the summer. What should they be doing? I will say there are tons of free test prep resources. So it doesn't mean you have to hire an incredibly expensive tutor to do that. But that is something your kid can do over the summer months, is if they're planning to take one of those fall tests in person or remote. We have, again, that we'll have to see what's happening. But that is an option. And I'll show you in a little bit. I have some resources that we can direct you to that are some of those free resources for testing. So that if you have questions about testing, I think that's really the major updates on that side of things. For those with seniors,
I was going to say, I have a question, Kristina.
Yeah.
So what about accommodations then for for all the parents who, I don't know if all you guys have 504 plans in place, CDN always encourages our students to get, that 504 plan in place and then subsequently register for accommodations once they arrive on campus. What does that look like? Or do you still suggest, students have them in place for the remote learning? CDN just did a webinar on remote learning accommodations and adjusting on that. So, and I'll include that in the link afterwards. But what does that look like? And then does that shift in terms of ACT, SAT, potentially taking an ACT online?
Yeah, and that's something that I think that would be a really significant reason why colleges like Claremont McKenna are probably coming out and saying, we're not going to accept this, because they don't know, for example, if a student has accommodations, what does that look like in the home setting? And also, I will tell you that there are students that are registered right now that I know that are taking the AP exams next week, which AP is owned by the College Board, which administers the SAT. There are students that I know who have extended time, or they've got some other kinds of accommodations for their testing, who have had zero communication from the College Board about what they're supposed to do next week for extended time, or to take advantage of their accommodations. There's so much, and again, we have to, I guess, give them a small amount of leeway because all this was kind of thrown together, but that's their job. They're testing agency. Before rolling it out, they really should. And so there was a long thread in one of my professional groups today. We have a closed Facebook group, and there was a long thread about what is this doing for students who need accommodations? Meaning, like, these kids it's an afterthought, that what happens, like, for example, if you're treating your low, and you're in the middle of, and they have some kind of a tracking software or something on your computer, and how will they ensure that is legitimate? Like, what does it cancel out your test, if you stop or you do something? I don't know that it's been thought through as much as it should have been by this point in time before they rolled it out. So that's where some of that uncertainty about, like, ACT and SAT testing at home also comes into play. But I do think it's still important, though, if your child has a 504 or they get any kind of accommodations, whether it's for this kind of test or school stuff, they should be really communicating and you should be advocating for them with the school, because, again, unfortunately, oftentimes our kiddos are, that kind of stuff gets pushed aside. It's kind of an afterthought that, oh, what about the kids that need this in that setting? And so we have to be the ones that are proactively communicating with the school counselor about how that's, what's happening. So, like, the students next week that haven't gotten any information about their accommodations for the APs, their counselors are overwhelmed right now with, what's going on with school stuff, end of year grades, changing to pass fail, et cetera. There's so much happening that it's, that no one really knows whose job is what. Good question, Anna. That's a really good question. I think in terms of another thing that I wanted to talk about, I touched on it briefly, was how do you even explore colleges from afar? Like, how do you do that when, really right now we're doing everything from home, and I will say, I don't know about you guys, but even my young kids have technology fatigue. I'm proud of all of you for logging on tonight, because I know being at a computer or using technology, we're done with it by this time. But kids, the last thing that a high school student wants to do is sit online and watch a virtual tour of a college, right? And so what I've told my students, here's some advice. If you've got a kid who's kind of being hesitant about exploring some things during this time that they're home, is try to meet them where they are in terms of technology. These kids still love things like Instagram, so I tell students, okay, if you don't want to do the virtual tour, get on Instagram then, and I want you to look up that college on Instagram, not the school-sponsored Instagram account necessarily. I mean, you can look at that, but look at what other people were posting pre-March 18th or 15th or whatever day you left from campus, or whatever you left from your high school. Check out what people were posting, and you'll get a good sense of the social vibe at a lot of campuses that way. If you notice that most of the pictures being posted are Greek, like this is a very fraternity sorority heavy campus and that's not for you, that tells you one thing. You might also see some political climate type things, does it feel very conservative, very liberal? You can get some of that from looking at those. But again, meeting kids kind of where they are, like say, okay, this is I see you scrolling on your phone. You might not want to watch a virtual tour, but at least go on and do this and check out this school that way. There are a lot of colleges that are doing, open houses and trying their best to move all their admission stuff online. I've sat in on some of them, and in full disclosure, they all kind of blur together. There's a lot that just sounds the same. But what I have found valuable is if you've got a kid who is interested in something specific in terms of major, pay attention to those open houses or those visit days. So if it's nursing or it's musical theater or whatever, and you see that they're doing a special 1-hour Q&A with someone from the faculty, those are the ones you want to get on. Even ninth graders should be doing that and could be doing that now. Colleges track demonstrated interest. I don't know if that's a term that people have heard, but demonstrated interest is basically the how much does the student love us factor. And it sounds creepy, but some of that's done through click-throughs. How much time is the student spending on our website? Are they clicking through our emails? And so during this time, that's their only way of getting any of that information, because you're not demonstrating interest by visiting campus. You're not demonstrating interest by meeting up with them at a reception at the local Marriott. So the click-throughs, if your child is getting those emails, they really should be paying attention to them. I have all my students create a separate email address actually for college stuff, like early on. So if you've got a 9th or 10th grader, that's the good thing to do. Have them create a Gmail account that is just for their college, that they just use for those things. That way it doesn't get lost in all their school stuff or other, and they know to check it. They know that's what they should be using. So that's one thing that I would mention. I'm going to give you some other resources that I'll share later with the stuff that we send out for virtual visits and good sites for those kinds of things. So that's one thing. Anything about that I didn't answer, Anna, or anything that you think would be good information?
I'll see if anybody has any questions. I think, there's been a lot of talk, and for what we find, we do a lot of off to college events with JDRF, and we have a call to trying to figure out how we can continue to do some of these off to college events, for everybody virtually. But, a lot of people, and we talked about this earlier, Kristina, will do, for parents especially, the fear factor of sending a kid or considering a school. I live in Boston. Do I even consider schools in California that could be a dream school, that have a dream program that my kiddo is dying to go on? And, so many people choose schools based off of, specific criteria or certain majors. Is that out the window? I mean, nobody knows what 2021 or 2022 is going to look like, but in terms of, the close to home, I know we talked about, does the prestige and the name of the school still matter at this point, if the potential of that on-campus physical feel of not being there could potentially be the norm?
Yeah, and that's probably one of the biggest concerns right now for families is, in terms of, am I going to pay $65,000 to do remote learning to attend, insert name of prestigious institution, when you could possibly be going to a local college or a local community college, even for the first 2 years. And I will tell you, one of my favorite books, if you're looking for something that's not on online, staring at a screen, you're looking for a physical book to read. My recommendation for all parents is a book that's called Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be. And it was written by a guy named Frank Bruni, he's a writer, a columnist, sometimes on CNN. But he wrote this book a couple years ago, and it's awesome. I have actually given out multiple copies of this from my office because I'll be in conversations with families about name brand. Does it matter where I'm actually getting my degree? Absolutely, it matters. I mean, there's studies that show, if you look at something like the Fortune 500 list of, CEOs and where their degrees are from, you'll see a lot of more selective schools. But what they don't show you is a lot of those degrees, those are graduate degrees. Those are not their undergraduate degrees. Mm-hmm. Those are graduate degrees. So you have a lot of people who've gone on to do successful things who have done their undergraduate work at potentially a small private liberal arts college near them, and then have gone on to Harvard Law School or, whatever other place it is. So what this book talks about is it's not so much about the name of the school. It's about what you are doing with your time there. Are you taking advantage of the resources there and that you're given? And, you know, speaking of Harvard Law School, on their website, they have a list every year. They update it with a list of all the undergraduate institutions where their students have come from. The list is like last year, I think it was 150 or 160 institutions. That's a lot of schools. They're not just pulling from the other Ivies, you know, they're pulling from all kinds of schools that most likely most people on this call have never heard of. However, those students have done well enough on their LSATs to get into Harvard Law School. So that means they've done something, you know, at the undergraduate level. The other thing, and this can be in the resources maybe that we share too afterwards, Anna, is there's a great talk by Malcolm Gladwell, who many of you might recognize that name. He's an author as well, an economist. Malcolm Gladwell has a great keynote that he did several years ago where he talks basically about, you know, being a big fish in a small pond, or, you know, a small fish in a big pond, and what are the outcomes with colleges? Does it matter what the name is on your school? And it's really eye-opening. So not that I will say, in full disclosure, we have students that work with us at Estrela, that we have students everything from our local community colleges where they go to Stanford, to MIT, to Columbia. You know, we've got kids going all over the place, but it's about fit, you know, so we're trying to find fit. So going back to your question, clearly I'm very passionate about this topic, sorry. But going back to your original question is, you know, should you, if you're considering a faraway school, you know, and now in light of this, you know, does that change your search? For a lot of families, it absolutely will. And I will say, you know, if I put on my mom hat, and if I were the mom of a senior or a junior, would I be thinking, gosh, do I want my type 1 child, you know, my kid who has type 1, do I want them so far away if something like this were to happen, or if this continues? You know, I think a lot of it has to be, you have to look at the schools that they're thinking, where they're planning to go. I have some colleges that are communicating with my students daily about their plans, and my students feel very comfortable about what they're getting into. Again, going back to these words, leaning towards, expecting, hoping, you know, if they're on campus in the fall, then they right now are feeling comfortable about that decision. That could change at any moment, you know, and as parents, we all care about, you know, obviously what's happening with our kids. Of course, things like Dexcom, we can pay attention a little bit more. But, you know, for me being in Ohio, if I have a kid who's looking at, you know, USC or Chapman or somewhere in California, I might say to my kid, you know, maybe we want to look at some, just at, you know, having some local options as well. The other thing is, I've had some families ask me, does this whole thing mean it's going to be easier to get into those hard colleges? You know, is it going to be easier to get into the Ivies and MIT and Stanford and Duke and et cetera? No, I don't think it is. And this is where my opinion comes in. I don't think so, because there are just as many highly intelligent kids who live in close proximity to Duke, who would maybe potentially be looking outside of that area otherwise, but now have decided, you know what, I want to stay closer, so I'm going to look at my selective closer option. And we have that here in Cleveland, for example. I work with students all over the place, but my local kids, I have a couple kids who now all of a sudden Case Western looks really attractive to them. Before they were only looking in Boston, you know, and now they're thinking they want to stay closer to home. There's a National Association for College Admission Counseling that every year they put out a list of colleges that are still accepting late applications, like this late in the game. Usually it comes out at the end of May. It came out yesterday. They released it early. So, and that's on one of the resources that we'll share. There's a list of schools that are still accepting applications or have reopened their application because they know kids are changing their minds. And that's really helpful, because it's not, you know, there's like 700 and something colleges on there. So it's not like there's 10 schools that are still taking kids. There's lots, you know, and so you've got a lot of options that you can choose from. If you're, you know, later in the game, I know there's at least one family on here that has a senior. For juniors, again, that list comes out every year. So, you know, if your kid wants to make a change late in the game, that'll happen again next year. Hopefully this won't happen again next year, but there is opportunity for movement. And then one last thing I'll mention about that choice of college piece, Anna, is There are some families that are thinking, you know, I might want to apply and then maybe defer, you know, not come this year. Maybe I'll take a gap year. The idea of the gap year is a wonderful one in normal times. I'm a very big proponent of a gap year because most other countries outside of the United States, a gap year is fully normal and students do that. I think a lot of high school kids going right into college are too young, they're not ready, and should take a year to do something. Gap year is not going to look like that now because what we would traditionally do with the gap year, you know, studying abroad or traveling abroad, internships, you know, that kind of stuff, going to be harder to do. So does a gap year mean you're sitting at home, you know, on your parents' couch, watching Little Fires Everywhere? You know, I don't know. And so it's different. And colleges have the choice of whether or not they'll allow students to defer for a year or not. They'll, you know, they could say no. I will say schools like Harvard, for example, forever that I can remember, Harvard, their Dean of Admission, Bill Fitzsimmons, he's had in his acceptance letter, it has always said, we want you to take a gap. We want you to defer for a year. That's in their acceptance letter. So they actually have always encouraged students to do it. Now more students might actually take them up on it though, you know, and take a year off and come next year, which could potentially mean for those juniors on the call, that's where the selectivity piece is really the question mark. If you've got all these kids taking a year off and then coming next year and who have already been accepted and they're deferring, so they've already got a spot for next year, does that make the admission process more selective for the class of 2021? Potentially. And then it trickles down obviously to 2022, et cetera. So
interesting. That I'm learning a lot just myself. We have could you repeat the book title for us, Kristina? We'll also share it, but I kind of want to read this book now too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I wish I would have grabbed it with my lovely pens when I went to my office. It's called Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be. And it's by Frank Bruni, Bruni. It's an incredible book, easy read. It's short chapters and it talks about all kinds of people, you know, for example, Warren Buffett started college at Western Nebraska University. Probably most of you have never even heard Western Nebraska University, you know, but there are a lot of people who have gone on to do great things, who've gone to some schools that would be surprising, like a great, I'm in Ohio, so I'll bring up like Denison, for example, has people like, the former CEO of Disney went to Denison, Steve Carell went to Denison, Jennifer Garner went to Denison. You know, they've got all these people who've gone and they started at this, you know, small liberal arts college in a rural part of Ohio. You know, so you'd be surprised. I always like to look at alumni from institutions, and there's another great book I'll recommend. Don't get me too much on a tangent with this, Anna, because I'll rattle off like 20 books. I mean, maybe people want a reading list, which is fine. There is actually on our blog, on our Estrela blog, we put together a reading list last summer. So that's on our blog if anyone's really interested. But another really good book is called Colleges That Change Lives. And Colleges That Change Lives was written by the former education editor of the New York Times. His name was Loren Pope. And Loren Pope worked for years writing about higher education for the Times, and he decided he wanted to write a book. And his first book was called Looking Beyond the Ivy League. And it was really just talking with families about, you know, the Ivies are great, but they're not right for everyone. They just aren't. Even if you have the academic credentials to get in, it doesn't mean it's the best fit for you. And so he wrote about that. But then he also wrote a second book called Colleges That Change Lives. And what he did was he went around to colleges all throughout the country and kind of incognito, schools that he thought were doing things in a different way that needed to have some recognition. So he chose a handful of schools, 40 schools in the initial book, where that changed lives. And he interviewed students about why that was. What is it about the school? So you'll have schools in this book, and it's been redone a couple times, and now it's an actual organization as well as the book. They have a group that travels together when we're able to travel, that travels together and does college fairs all around the country with representatives from these schools. And they're really interesting. Schools like, for example, Ohio Wesleyan here in Ohio, to New College in Florida, to Evergreen State in Washington. They're all over. But if you have time and you're interested in reading about some really amazing schools that you would maybe never have heard of, who produce some pretty incredible graduates, that's a great book to check out. But the reason I bring it up is Loren Pope he used to, I worked at one of those schools in that book. That's not why I mentioned it. I actually think it's a great book. I worked at one of those schools, and I had the opportunity to travel and do those fairs and travel with Lauren Pope for about 5 years. And every night before the fairs, he would get up and do a little talk. And he would say, choosing a college, it should be like you would choose a hospital. And he said, you don't choose a hospital by how sick the patients are that come in. It's not like, oh, let me look at what's happening on the beginning stage of this. You're choosing it based on the outcomes. Which hospitals are doing the best and, getting their patients well and, and curing things, or whatever. And so he talked like that about colleges. He said, don't look at the average ACT scores of incoming students. That makes no sense. Like, that doesn't tell you anything about what the college is doing itself. What does tell you something is, what are graduates doing when they're done? And so that's I always have thought that was a really good way to look at, choosing colleges. So again, my tangent.
I wish I had that advice. My dad would, left a giant encyclopedia of 300 best colleges as my summer as a junior, and forced me to highlight 10 to go look at, 20 years ago. Not 20 years ago, but now I think that's great advice. I think that's really great advice. I wanted to touch base. There was a couple of people that, for those of you who don't know, we have a really, really active parent Facebook group with College Diabetes Network. It's called, wait for it, Parents of the College Diabetes Network. We have close to 2,000 members in there, and a lot of parents asked to join that group once, their kid hits 8th grade or even, earlier on, because as you all know, some of you are in the 9th, 10th grade, and this process is, right around the corner. So, but accommodations is something that is, obviously very close to heart. Can we talk about accommodations? We have a question here, but I know that is top of mind for some people, and wanted to make sure we covered that in terms of what to look for, what to not look for. Does that impact your school choice? What have you found across the board in terms of when you're working with families that have something like T1D when approaching schools, and how would you say that has shifted some of their thought process, just given the current situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, with any families looking at colleges that have some kind of a medical need or something that, or even some of my students who have diagnosed learning differences, sometimes they're hesitant to disclose any of that information for many reasons. And I feel like one of the biggest shifts that's happened over the last couple of years is we have more students who are sharing that information earlier on, because they know they need to be put in contact with the right support on campus. So whether that, for example, the biggest consideration, I saw there was a question for, so if a student's already planning to go to college next fall, what should they be thinking about? One of the things I'd say from an accommodations or a standpoint of a family with a child with a medical need, or T1D, many colleges, one of the things that's top of the list for changes on college campuses for the fall is moving to single rooms. And I know for some parents that would be a concern, that their child would be, first time alone, first time in independence, having nobody there with them in case of anything. And so that would be something, I think, for me as a parent, I would be concerned, if my 17 or 18-year-old child who maybe they'd gone to camp, but we all know, diabetes camp, there's people watching, that's that kind of thing. So if your child's not experienced that could be a concern. But the college, that would be a question I'd ask, is there an opportunity to instead of having single rooms, would they be able to have another roommate, have a roommate with them, even though everybody else is, doing the single room. I think in terms of accommodations on campus, I do think communication with residential life is hugely important, the residential life in general, but also the academic dean, making sure for the reason, it's when you're if there's remote learning happening, I think it's important when a teen has type 1 and they are doing remote learning, they still need those same kinds of accommodations as if they were in person. If they are having needing to miss a class or needing to take time out or something like that, and they miss a Zoom call, for example, you wouldn't want a faculty member to just make assumptions of why they're doing that. So there needs to be communication, making sure that those same accommodations and understanding and empathy that happen in an in-person setting, that those are being translated to the remote learning options as well. There are some colleges that are considering for the fall. So going back to the question about this fall, and this is something I think is going to impact colleges even beyond this year. So those with 2021 kids, 2022, many colleges right now have rushed to implement technology so that they can do remote learning. They are not going to just scrap that once kids, even if we can get back to normal in the fall, there's no way they're just going to scrap all this investment that they've just made into this remote learning stuff, and they're still doing. So we can fully expect that remote learning will become part of college, and whether that students are living on campus and maybe they're doing 1 or 2 of their classes virtually, but they are still residential, they're still living there. That's a possibility definitely for this fall. Lots of colleges, that's what I was on a call with a college just last week that said their plan is to bring students back, give kids single rooms. Everyone's going to have a single room on campus, or a hotel room. That's the other thing, because a lot of colleges obviously don't have space to give all the kids a single room. So they're partnering with local hotels to do that. And what they'll be doing is one group of students would be having classes Mondays, Wednesdays in person. The other group would be doing Tuesdays and Thursdays, and Friday would be an off day for everybody. So it's almost like they're trying to, lessen the number of interactions that kids are having. Now, how that impacts, dining halls, the fitness center, the library, I don't know, how I assume they'll have, I even heard one college said, we'll do it by alphabet, if your last name is on these days, or is in this part of the alphabet, this is your time for lunch, it's lots of things that'll change. So, but I do think in terms of going back to what I said at the beginning, with the accommodations piece, I would just say, if you're going to be a squeaky wheel, this is a time to do it, because you fall risk of being forgotten, that this is, again, going back to that testing accommodations piece, it's very easy to forget this subgroup of kids who need some support in this way. So that's my suggestion. It's okay to be a squeaky wheel. You're a customer, that's the other thing, is you are a customer of the colleges. Even though the colleges are doing the accepting or not, I always have to remind families, you are paying a lot for this experience. So, you should have a certain level of expectation of what you're receiving. Yeah.
And one of the things, really great points, Kristina, that I'll just add to is, and I'll include this link also, in terms of the remote accommodations. What we've been hearing from some of the offices of disability services is that it's some of those same things. They're trying to figure out, not just T1D, but, everything across the board. What does that look like? And, the earlier you can start communicating with those schools, the better. And that was going to be kind of my, question back to you is, what, in terms of what and when, for the seniors and the juniors, in terms of accommodations, to start reaching out, because what we've heard from some schools is that they don't even have time for the kind of prospective families, because they're trying to handle so many negotiations for the current students that have to make adjustments to their plans. And one of the things I'll kind of recommend is, start putting together kind of your Office of Accommodations and, what you want, now, not now, but, make sure you're aware of what you're entitled to and allowed to. Our Facebook group, that's one of the most common asked questions is, what type of accommodations do you look for? If it's a fridge in the room for insulin, if it's proximity to a dining hall, if it's priority registration for a certain time of day. I think those might look a lot different. We don't know. But I think the sooner you start, having those conversations, I can only imagine what sort of kind of waiting period or line there might be for those senior families.
Yeah, and I would say, along those lines, and this is going even to the senior families, and then including some of the underclass families as well, is having worked in admission, in an admission office, I can tell you, they're not well versed in all of that. Their job is to recruit, enroll, and then hand off, really. And so this might be, and that's why it's a great idea, Anna, to come up with a list of those questions and be ready and be prepared going into conversations, whether it's with, depending on if it's the Office of Disability Services, if it's, the other thing is, I should say, if you've not already done some research into colleges, is that a lot of colleges don't have the same kind of name for the offices that handle these things, or they don't all fall under the same umbrella. Sometimes it's even within, a VP of such and such handles these particular functions on campus, and it could be make zero sense that person is reporting to this person, So I would say have your questions ready, and feel free to, especially if you're a senior family right now, bypass admissions, bypass that to get your answers, go to the right person on campus. In fact, the admission, unless you're negotiating something like a deferment or financial aid or something like that at this point, you should be reaching out to the specific department on campus that's doing it. And I think, and you guys you have so many good resources, I think, at CDN to help families through this. But one thing that we'll often get from families is there's lack of understanding that accommodations are not a given, in terms of like your 504 doesn't go with, it doesn't just go with you. It doesn't just become, your college one, it's different. The colleges will have different ways of handling things, and different people that you need to make your requests to. And the earlier you can do that and find that information out, the better. For those of you with underclassmen, if you, at the point when we are back to getting on campuses for physical campus visits, never be afraid to ask to schedule a time to meet with somebody from Disability Services while you're there on campus. And again, that title, it may not be called disability, so it might be called something else on campus, but you let them know, the admission office, say, we want to meet with somebody to talk about how these things are handled on campus. And keep in mind that when you're going through the admission process, those people are paid to be the welcome wagon. They're paid to be the nicest people that you will encounter on campus, and the most helpful. If they're not, think about what your experience will be like as a family, and when your child enrolls there, interacting with the people who are not paid to be nice. So a lot of those things is really, really, they're really things that you got to just pay attention to when you're going through the process. So
all good points. We have a question about celiac. And I know this may be more of a specific question, but I think, dining is definitely something to consider. I know there's lists on like the best food. There's lists on everything. Can you talk about that a little bit, Kristina, if you're able to?
Yeah, for sure. I will say, so I spend in a regular year, not right now, but in a regular year, I usually spend about 4 to 6 weeks a year visiting colleges all over the country. I've been to almost 500 colleges. And I will tell you, the dining halls really vary. Dining options, I should say, not even dining halls, because like traditional dining halls that we were used to, things are so different now. Now you've got food courts, now you've got the little cafes that spring up in the dorms. And so when you're thinking of things like celiac, you're looking at options across campus. Again, a lot of these colleges now outsource their food service to a company. And so, for example, if you're looking at a college that uses Bon Appetit is a good example as their food service provider, those people know what they're doing. I feel like that, they do it so frequently on, they're doing it across campuses. But where you get into issues is when they've got so many different kinds of meal options around campus to be able to guarantee, of course, in the main dining hall, there's going to be the gluten-free options. But how do you know there's not cross-contamination in some of those other spots on campus? And that's a question when I have families going on tours. don't just ask the tour guide, because the tour guide, unless there's somebody who also has celiac, they will say, oh yeah, we have a gluten-free station over there. That's usually the answer. But what I would say is if you can talk with someone, even from food services, that's totally appropriate. It's always appropriate to ask, to go right to the source and say, I would like to know, what you do to ensure that, my child's going to be safe in this environment with this. And obviously if you are visiting a college and they haven't offered you an opportunity to eat on campus, you can ask, you can say, can we have a meal on campus while we're here? I encourage that of every one of my students anyway. And they might say, sure, here's a pass to go and eat in the dining hall. Or they might say, yes, it's just a, pay for your own meal kind of thing. But take the time to do that, because you will also, if you are a parent of a child with celiac, your eyes are going to be watching what's happening. And is that truly a gluten-free station there? And, how can I make sure that my child is okay? But it's become much more common on college campuses. When I first started in higher education, it was not, no one understood it. And it wasn't, again, it was not something that I think many families even asked about. I have as an aside, I have a Pinterest page, an Estrela Pinterest page, and I have one of my boards is like on gluten-free and nut allergies and resources for families for that. So you could look at that. There might be some good resources on there to check out. It'll have listings of, colleges that offer or that are, I would say, have proven that they can do that well, serve kids with celiac well. And that should be, I think that should be one of your search criteria. That should be just along the same as when you're looking at, do they have a rock climbing wall? Do they have, this program? Do they have this? Your medical needs also, those should be top, those should be right at the top in terms of search options. There's almost 4,000 colleges in the United States. There are lots of colleges doing celiac well, support for students with celiac really well. And so again, don't be afraid to talk with somebody from the food services. The colleges, they will, and again, keep in mind, if they give you pushback and they say, well, we don't do that, or that's weird, or, why would we want to do that? Those are the people that are trying to sell you on it. So if they are treating you that way, keep that in your mind, take notes on that. So yeah, that's a good question.
The other point I would say to that too is, that's where you can utilize your Facebook groups of, anyone else have, a kiddo out there that is celiac. It's so much more common than you think. Find out what, anyone have a celiac kiddo that's been to X, these 5 schools. We also have, we have 160 CDN chapters, out there. So more often than not, the parents are the ones that are going to, advocate for their kids and their kids' schools. And even if their kid doesn't go to that school, they may have looked at that school. So I think, that's always a great place to go.
Yeah. And also to have options. That's the other thing is when you think of it, this, again, thinking back to I think about 10 years ago, the gluten-free station, was there wasn't a lot of options for the students. It was bad. It was bad food, it was not. And whereas now I was just on a college visit right before all of this happened. My very last visit, I went on a counselor fly-in, and the bulk of the students they said that they actually prefer the gluten-free options. The food is better. The company makes the it's just better than, so of course then that means that they have to make more for, the people who don't need it to make sure that the students that need it have it, that it's accessible. So yeah, good question. Are there any other things, any other things or any other questions? If anybody has any questions and you want to throw them in the chat about anything, and I know this is all over the place. I hope some of this was useful information, if anything, my reading list for you. So one of the things I know we have a lot of people, I think, who are maybe you can't see the screen or on the phone, but Anna mentioned we'll send some resources out with links, and I mentioned some of those things. We have on our website right now, we have a running resource page that we update at least once or twice a week with resources that are related to this the impact of the COVID-19 era on college admission. And that includes some really tangible resources like the list of colleges that are still accepting applications, the what's happening with exams, ACT, SAT, et cetera. But also we have a couple of like articles or blog posts that we think are really good. There's one from the dean at the University of Chicago, the dean of admission there, that is just calming in a lot of ways about how this process will pan out, not just for this year's seniors, but future students in terms of, you know, they know what they're doing in reviewing applications. So even though the process might look different for you, if you've got a freshman or a sophomore, junior, it might look different next year or the year after, but the admission people, they know how to shape a class. They know what to look for in students. And if that, you know, if they don't have one piece of it, that's okay. They know what else to look for. Oh, a good question just came in. I just saw it out of the corner of my eye. Yeah. Do you want to take it, Ann, or do you want me to?
You take it first, and then if you don't cover, I have a couple links that are
it's a
specified.
really,
So
really good
you chat first.
Yeah. And I love it because I actually, so Diabetes Scholars, the Diabetes Scholars program is now under the Beyond Type 1 umbrella, and you can apply for, there are several. I'm a reader for them, so I read scholarship applications, and I love it. I love your children. If you have a child who, I love reading them. You know, as a mom of a little child with type 1, it's inspiring to me to be able to read some of the stories of some of these kids. So yes, there's actually quite a few scholarships available for teens with type 1. One myth I've heard, actually, I have a friend who has a child with type 1 and who applied for some of these and didn't end up getting any last year, and said, oh, but you know, it's because, you know, he didn't go to Children's Congress, and he's not, you know, a Beyond Type 1 ambassador, and he's not doing a Dexcom commercial, you know, all these things. And I will say, when the reviewers are reviewing for those scholarships, what's really important actually is how your child is, how, you know, like there's a question there about how are they living beyond type 1? You know, how do you not be, you know, the diabetic? How do you be the, you know, you have a kid with type 1 diabetes. How do you share that yourself? How do you embrace it? How do you not? You know, it's really honesty, I think, is a big part of it. And involvement in other things is just as important. You know, maybe it's they've gone on to be the captain of their lacrosse team while they're managing type 1. That's, you know, that's incredible that if they're able to do that. Or maybe they have served as, you know, a mentor or something to other kids who are newly diagnosed in their school, but maybe they're not doing that through an organization. But so there, yes, that was a long answer, but yes, there are scholarships. And do you have other resources, Anna, besides the Diabetes Scholars?
The only one that comes to mind, Diabetes Scholars, is an awesome resource. Team Type 1 through Novo Nordisk has a lot of athletic scholarships out there for student athletes with type 1. And we can include that also. I'll make a note in terms of scholarship. But again, that's another great question for the parents on the Facebook group, because I think your best resource is those who have kind of been there, done that recently. Because there are thousands of moms out there who are in the same boat as you were, you know, 3-4 years ago, who answer every day anything about going abroad, extra supplies, this person, you know, endocrinologist, finding a new provider in a new city, town, clinic, you name it. So it's kind of fun to see what the new questions are. Any suggestions for what high school kids can be doing during digital schooling and stand out? I mean, I think that's like a great closing question, Kristina, as we have mostly under-ish classmen, especially right now.
Yeah, that is a great closing question. Thank you for asking, Laura. The question, so what could your kids be doing? I sat on a webinar a few weeks ago. I listened in. Again, my life is full of webinars now, presenting and listening. And there was a really, really good conversation with Rick Clark, who's the Dean of Admission at Georgia Tech, which is a selective school. And Rick said, and I know him, so it was easy for me to understand where he was coming from with this, that he said during this time, what they really hope to see from kids is that what they are doing when they feel like nobody's watching, meaning like nobody cares. Like, so if I choose to do this with my time, because I doesn't, you know, it's not like I'm not I'm not doing what I normally would be doing, like clubs and sports and all that kind of stuff, like, which is when people are watching, right? They're paying attention to how you're doing on the field or how you're doing in your play. But now that we're home and you have the option of, you know, picking up a new hobby. You know, I have a student right now, for example, who's teaching herself how to make meringue. Like, and I'm like, how are you getting the ingredients for all that? So I don't know what's involved in that, but it sounds complicated to me. But she's always wanted to cook, and she's been terrible at it. So this is what she's doing. She's doing like online tutorials in her free time. But Rick Clark, what he said, I will be just as interested in the kid who during this time tells me that he spent the time learning how to repair lawnmowers than a kid who tells me that they paid $5,000 to take an online class and insert, you know, whatever it is. He said, I would rather have the first kid because it gives me an idea of what that, you know, their curiosity, what are they doing to keep busy, whether it's they took up running, you know, or they did a, you know, you could certainly do things like Duolingo where, you know, free language classes. I know that's something really popular right now with some of my students who are just like, I've just been curious, what does this language sound like? So I'm doing a free class on Duolingo. And so I think in terms of, you know, what can they do to stand out? I think if they find something that they're passionate about, or maybe they've considered and they've never had an opportunity because they've been so overscheduled to really look at it, this is the time to do that. That would be such a good essay response, or, you know, in my mind, having read those essays in the past, I'd love to hear what a kid did when they thought nobody was watching, you know, like that it didn't matter, you know, and it could be something, but as parents, we might say, oh, do we want you know, he shouldn't be out repairing the lawnmower, you know, as great as that sounds, you know, we were tinkering with whatever. I'd rather they're reading, you know, the Iliad. Come on. Which I think, you know, I was on a webinar with another person who said, oh, these kids should be picking up the great books and reading. If you have a kid that is like that and would be thrilled doing that, great. Let them do that and encourage them to do that in their free time. If you have a kid that is looking at you like you're growing 3 heads when you even mentioned that, that's not for them. Maybe they've always wanted to read Harry Potter, for example, but they missed that window of time when it came, you know, it was like, you know, maybe before their time, after time, whatever. And they've just watched the movies, but now they're like, you know what, maybe I want to read it. Let them read Harry Potter. There are some kids, there was an article about these kids rebuilding their college and high school buildings out in Minecraft, like doing an exact replica of what their college campus or their high school building looks like. That's pretty cool. You know, that's like, again, we don't want kids to sit in front of screens all day, but I mean, that's really what they're doing now. But I will give you 2 quick things and then I'll stop, I promise. 2 other quick things. Today, I talked to one of my students who is interested in political science, and he's a junior, going to be a senior next year. And so he's going to reach out to our local members of Congress and see if he can volunteer some way remotely for them during this time. You know, he hadn't even thought about doing that because he was thinking he needed an in-person internship of some sort or that. And so he's going to do that. Another one of my students who's a history buff, he's reaching out to one of our local retirement homes to see if they have residents who have been in insert war time period, whatever, and he's going to do Zoom recorded interviews with them and create almost like a time capsule of stories from these kids or from these veterans. Isn't that, I think for me, that's incredible, because he would never have done that if he had all these other things going on, but now he's got time, so he's going to do that. And I thought, that's amazing. Also, what a gift for the families of those people at the retirement home. You know, he's going to surprise them by sending these recorded interviews to the family members. And so I just thought that was such a brilliant idea. So lots of cool things like that.
What great advice. The only other thing I would say, there's a question about, you know, local nonprofit diabetes organizations. I mean, I know a lot of, I'm a camp girl at heart, going to a local diabetes summer camp, and there is virtual camp happening this summer. So, and I know they are looking for volunteers. So I know that there's a lot of camp counselors, CDN chapter leaders, you know, JDRF team captains, rah-rahs out there. But there are options and opportunities, and maybe that is contradictory advice other than, you know, baking sourdough bread, but I guess I would probably just echo Kristina that, you know, do what makes you happy and try to find a way to be creative. There's so much creativity, from birthday party parades to baby showers to whatever is happening in your community, but I think it's, you know, trying to find a way to embrace this new reality that we're in. And CDN, if you're looking for more reading, we have a whole slew of resources on our website that are all free. They're digital and hard copy. Digital's probably the way to go now. Our Off to College booklets are probably our number one reviewed and viewed resource that is always distributed at all of our Off to College events and programs. And we'll be doing a number of those Off to College events that go in much more depth, talking about how to tell, talk to your roommate, talk to your RA, much more of that diabetes focus. And then Off to Work, and new this year, we actually will have a guide coming out in a couple of months on disability services and, specific guides for those offices, because we know, like Kristina said, there's not a lot of information out there at the campus administration level. So our goal as an organization is to really kind of, meet these offices where we want them to be. We want every family to walk into an accommodations office or a health center or a counseling center and have them be semi-familiar with diabetes. They don't have to know everything. They don't have to know what a basal rate is, but to be somewhat knowledgeable and be somewhat familiar that they're able to help families and navigate them and welcome them is what we strive for. So